Hey everyone. Today I want to talk about partisanship, specifically partisanship and its effects on both the brain and on the media environment. So today we're thinking about this from a couple of different perspectives, as I've just mentioned. The first of those is psychological. And I want to just review a couple of aspects of the reading that I think deserve some discussion before we get into our own discussion on Wednesday. I want to think about the partisan brain as this vehicle that is attempting to process new information that's coming to it from media, but is ultimately, as we've seen, engaging in a couple of non-median processing functions. And so we know that the partisan brain is hardwired to engage in what we call type 1 processing of political information. If you go back to the John Q. Public model that we read about a couple of weeks ago in class, you know a little bit about that type 1 processing and how it relates to and is different from type 2 processing, which is much more effortful and deliberate, and that causes people to really search their memory stores and think a lot more clearly about all of the available evidence. Instead, partisans often are going to engage in this kind of processing, type 1 processing, especially because this is the type of processing that we engage when we are being struck with highly emotional reactions. And so anytime our emotional sort of system gets involved when processing information, we are more likely to engage in this kind of quick and relatively less effortful type 1 processing. And in doing so, partisans are engaging in a balancing act of sorts. And that is because partisans are trying as much as possible when they're forming opinions, when they're learning things in the information environment. They've got these sometimes conflicting, not always conflicting, but occasionally conflicting goals. And the first one is that they're trying to be accurate. And so you might think about why that is. Even the most staunchly loyal partisan still wants to know some things about the world around them that are, unbiased, because that seems like an evolutionary trait, like it's something that we would want to have as humans who are trying to live and survive in the world. You want to actually have decent information about what's out there, because there could be threats, right, that we need to guard ourselves against, we need to defend against. And so you want to seek out high quality information, especially information in the news, which could contain potential warnings of threats out there for us. So we want to be right. We want to know the truth about the world around us. But partisans also possess, and again, this goes back to the type 1 emotional engagement piece, they possess a desire to feel good about their in-group. And their in-group as a partisan is a political party. So when we think about partisanship in general, we think about an emotional attachment, an affective group attachment, much like somebody's loyalty to the home team in a sporting event, right? They wear the jersey, they go to the game, they participate, they cheer for their in-party or their in-group or their home team as much as possible. In that mode, because we feel this social identity and this attachment to this group, any news that we might receive that casts that party or that group in a negative light, right? Much like if we were to, look at the score of a game and see that our team lost by a bazillion points, right? That causes us to not feel very good. And so those kinds of news stories, those kinds of items, we tend as partisans to not want to look at. It's uncomfortable. It makes us feel bad. And it's especially problematic for us emotionally because in the partisan brain, you've built up this idea that your ideology, your political party is morally superior. Often we see this moral superiority kind of thing, where we think that the party is this just and highly effective group that's going to lead America to some kind of positive outcome. And so when we see some kind of evidence that the opposite is happening, then there's this cognitive dissonance. There's this crunching, grinding of gears that happens in our brains where we think to ourselves, oh no, how could this possibly be, right? Either my prior assumption that the party is better than the other guys is wrong, which of course we can't allow ourselves to think that, or this information is something that I need to discredit in some way or rationalize away. And so the partisan brain then is engaging in sometimes quite effortful rationalizations to try to dismiss evidence that counteracts their pre-existing beliefs about the moral upstandingness and the performance of a political party. Now, it's interesting to think about this effortful nature of the justification, because often we think about humans as cognitive misers. I know that earlier we were talking about cognitive miserliness and the idea that we're trying to preserve scarce cognitive resources all the time. This means that partisans are often going to employ certain mental shortcuts, what we call heuristics, in order to process information very efficiently. And so this means that the partisan brain also engages in a lot of snap judgment kind of reactions to new political situations, to new political information, and are able to very effortlessly distinguish between stuff that they should pay attention to, that they should trust, and stuff that they should dismiss. And a lot of that comes down to source cues. So information, as we know, comes attached to all sorts of different cues, as you can read about in the reading for this week, that give us signals, that give us information about whether we should buy the information. And so partisans ultimately are going to think about, who am I hearing this information from? Can I use an emotion-laden processing heuristic, or just a very basic mental shortcut, to determine whether to think about this and to trust it and to try to memorize this information? Or should I simply close the door on learning anything from this source? And so source cues, for example, are really efficient ways that partisans can amp up the bias, basically, to preserve that self-esteem that comes along with being a partisan. So psychologically, again, the idea of cognitive miserliness, the idea that we are trying as much as possible to preserve the social identity, the positive connotations of our social group, combine to mean that we often make sort of partially informed snap judgments about learning. And so the partisan brain, therefore, is less likely than otherwise to engage in what we might call sort of fair or unbiased kind of updating of information. And this is really the mechanism in terms of how it works. Social scientists have come to think about this phenomenon with the moniker partisan motivated reasoning. And this is the specific process where learning is happening. And partisans are maybe learning things in a non-median way that leads to certain biases. And so, again, PMR, partisan motivated reasoning, is what happens when partisans learn new things, update their prior beliefs, and acquire biased opinions, or come to form biased opinions through that updating process. And again, as I've mentioned, a lot of the sort of nuts and bolts of this process has to do with when our affect and our feelings about the home team overrides the rational updating of our prior beliefs. And ultimately, what PMR, as I've kind of described over the last couple of slides, really explains, is why partisans tend to view information that is presented to them in an unbiased fashion, and often come to strengthen their congenial beliefs. And by congenial, I mean their sort of beliefs that make them feel good, right? They're good feeling beliefs, congeniality. It strengthens congenial beliefs when they learn information that makes them feel good. But when they learn other information that makes them feel not so good, they fail to strengthen any counter-attitudinal or sort of non-feel-good beliefs, as long as that information is making them feel bad. And so PMR is a process that is psychological in nature and that relates specifically to American partisans' sort of independent learning process, how they do this as just an individual confronting information. And so critically, this theory of PMR can happen even when partisans are being given the exact same information. So you can give two partisans the same exact news story, and they may come to draw different conclusions about which party is better, which party is doing a good job, which party is upstanding, and which party is not. Again, on the basis of the exact same informational communication. And so this is a really big deal, because what it says to us is that the information environment maybe doesn't matter that much. It's really about partisan brains and the fact that they're interpreting this information that's coming to them in a biased fashion. So why worry about the media environment and the idea that there's biased news out there? Because even if we had a purely unbiased news environment, we'd still have partisans drawing the opposite conclusions about stories because of this process. So that's one layer, potentially, of this biased opinion framework We want to think also, though, about the possibility that in the information environment, there are more opportunities for people to hear congenial information if they're able to choose their news. And so selective exposure is another theory on top of PMR, which makes the argument that over time, partisans come to associate some sources with positive affect and some sources with negative affect. As you think about the partisan, right, they're flipping through news channels, they're trying to figure out what sources should I watch, and they say, every time I watch source A, I hear a lot of things that makes me feel bad as a partisan, and I feel this cognitive dissonance, and it's not a very good feeling, right? However, if I go to source B, or I guess I flip these around in my discussion, right? Source A makes me feel really good. Source B, though, is this thing that makes me feel really lousy all the time. And I keep hearing all this information that makes me feel like my party's not very morally upstanding or doing a good job. And so, as a result, the partisan who felt good about source A is going to start just naturally gravitating towards watching source A more and more. Hey, I like this. This feels good. Source B, though, is going to be suddenly popularized, right, by members of the out party, the other party. And so all of a sudden you'll see that these stark gaps in viewership of sources A and B emerge. And so, for example, if we said that source A was a news network called Fox News, and it were to have come on the air over the span of like the early 2000s, we actually saw a lot of Democrats actually started watching Fox News as a new cable alternative, and quickly, not that slowly, over the span of only a few years, abandoned Fox News, and Republicans started to watch it more and more. And so that's like a very clear-cut story of how selective exposure started to occur over that time period. 5 years essentially, when audiences saw a new network and then got a chance to see what was on that network, and then voted with their feet essentially, or voted with their channel changers, and ultimately we now have a network that is consumed by the vast majority of audience members being partisan Republicans. And so, I mean, this is a process that, again, on top of partisan motivated reasoning, is another layer. If these things are available, if we've got partisan media that have very clear differences in terms of the amount of congenial content we can consume, we start to get habitual news viewers, choosing ultimately through selective exposure to only consume news from trusted, pro-partisan sources. So again, with partisan news, because we've got PMR going on, and because we've got this need to preserve the good feelings, right, the congenial feelings about our party, it's actually quite easy to attract a partisan audience, right? Just exclusively say things that make your audience feel good, and you're going to eventually have a partisan following, right? But as a social scientist, there's a lot of open questions that I think we want to contend with in this class about this, because if you think about it, right, if we've got these partisan media that are available to us, there's a question about whether this is a supply story in terms of the coverage coming, and being designed to attract these partisan audiences, or whether selective exposure is causing these audiences to demand ultimately partisan coverage. So it's not clear, right, whether partisan media ever actually change anyone's mind, especially after motivated reasoning and selective exposure have taken their toll on the distribution of consumers. Right? Are partisan media changing people's minds, or ultimately is it just people who are predisposed to learn and to believe this stuff changing channels to select into what they already prefer? It's unclear what the true effect, right? What's the Fox News effect, or what's the MSNBC effect on people's attitudes? It's actually really, really hard to disentangle, because the selective exposure piece is also part of the story. I do want to mention, though, that we are entering a new and different era of partisan media that we want to talk about, we want to think about in this week's reading and in this week's class discussion. And that is what's going on with the additional proliferation of more of these kinds of sources. With the internet and with additional cable channels coming online, we now have an even further extreme set of partisan media that exist to perpetuate narratives that are increasingly outlandish in terms of their kind of blind commitment to partisan talking points. And it really makes you wonder, right? Is this same question of whether partisan media are changing minds, or if audiences are changing channels, right? If that applies also to this next wave, ultimately, of hyperpartisan news. So I'll leave you with a few questions to consider as you do the reading for this week. The first being, do we think that a lot of Americans engage in partisan motivated reasoning, and do they do it a lot of the time? Right? Is partisan motivated reasoning a widespread phenomenon? Is it a fairly rare phenomenon? Where do you fall, essentially, on that debate, given what you think you know about these consumers? Second, I want to know, are we engaging in selective exposure, on a widespread basis as well? Are people choosing news in a partisan congenial way, or is this something that's relatively rare, right? We say this is happening among 10% of the population, 5%, 20%, 100%, right? I want to get your assessment of whether or not partisan media is really is really a big deal in America, or whether it's a relatively small story, all things considered. And then finally, again, I kind of have teed you up to think about this, right? Is the proliferation of partisan news, the strength of partisan news in America, a supply story? Is this really about these outlets creating content and distributing it to audiences and creating new partisans? Or is it really a demand story where we've got partisans that crave congenial content and demanded essentially that people set up news networks that would cater to them? I guess differently put, the question is, right, do partisan news sources actually change people's minds? Or is this really about, ultimately, news sources that exist purely to preach to the choir? Because if again, nobody's consuming these news sources that didn't already like the party that they're basically supporting with their coverage, does that really change anyone's mind? And in what ways would it do it? So those are some things to think about as you do this reading. I look forward to a very robust discussion about these psychological phenomena and about the phenomenon, in fact, the growing phenomenon, right, of niche ideological and partisan news sources that are continuing to spread to the sort of furthest left and right reaches of the ideological spectrum in America today. So I look forward to that discussion, and I'll see you very soon. Take care.